we can add some more people to this wonderful program today. I think that's working. And Matt, if you can give us a thumbs up when we see that. Okay, we've got Marilyn from Clinton, Illinois. Wonderful.
Yeah, we are on Facebook Live. We are good.
Wonderful. Okay, then I can give my official greetings. Welcome, everybody. I'm Kim N. I'm president of Dunes-Calumet Audubon. We do have some other board members on with us today, and Matt Kawasinski, the vice president of Dunes-Calumet Audubon, will be monitoring our Facebook live streams. So we're very happy to have all of this working today. So I'm going to do a little promo here on what's going on with Dunes-Calumet. So if you can see this, hopefully this
Okay,
will
come on.
work out. Okay. So
Okay.
this Saturday, oh, I hear somebody has an extra voice out there.
Saturday,
We're going to be
Meadowbrook.
at Meadowbrook, yes. And so
Okay.
we're meeting at 9 a.m. At Meadowbrook, and you can register through Eventbrite on getting there. I'm very excited to join this group. Julie's going to be leading it, and we'll have a representative from Shirley Hines Land Trust, which is the Meadowbrook property, helping us learn a little bit more about it. So that'll be fun.
Yep.
Then we do have two woodcock wanders, led by our very own woodcock Dan. And one is going to be on April 25th, Friday at Hoosier Prairie, 7:30 p.m. That's in Lake County. And then we have one in Porter County on Friday, May 2nd at the Indiana Dunes State Park. Both of those are also registration is on Eventbrite. Very exciting to see those. And then we have our first Saturday of the month. Saturday, May 3rd is going to be our bird walk that we do at the Indiana Dunes State Park. This one's going to be an extended bird walk. They're going to go a little bit farther to go through. I believe they're going to be adding a longer trail so that you can see more of the warblers because they'll be coming through at this time. So that's going to be a fun walk. And then the next day, we have our first Sunday of the month bird walk, and this is at the Paul Douglas Center in Miller. Starts at 9 a.m. The one on Saturday starts at 8. This one starts at 9. This one you don't need to register on Eventbrite. You just need to show up. It's on Lake Street. You can email us if you need more information on how to get there. This will be our second time partnering with the National Park at the Douglas Center, which is at Miller Woods and has a lot of great birding, and there's a lot of great different habitat there too. And then last but not least, you can order Dunes-Calumet merchandise on Threadless. They have our logo stuff and you can pick out a variety of things. We also have, I don't know if you can see me. I'll turn this off and then you can see what I have to share to show you. If I can, where's my little cursor? There we go. Okay, so we also have our Dunes-Calumet caps. These will be available for sale at our native plant sale coming up in May. The native plant sale is at the Indiana Dunes Birding Festival from May 15th through the 18th. There will be some information updated on our website tomorrow. But if you're interested in a hat before then, send us an email and we'll see what we can do to connect with you. We're also going to be selling our cute little kingfisher magnets made by the Laser Leaf, and they come in different trees. This is a black cherry, and this happens to be a beech. The proceeds from these little magnets are going to fill our fund for grants that we can give out grants to help habitat and protection of birds. And more information about that will be coming on our website too. So there's a lot of things going on. And if you need more information, check out our Facebook, get on our email if you're not on our email list, and check out our website. or you can always email us a question. We don't mind that. So now I want to do our introduction for Sarah. I'm very excited to hear more about her studies of the Black-crowned Night Herons. Um, they're a fascinating heron. I can't believe that they're to me they seem so little and short and interesting because I don't get to see them very much. I don't find them in Porter County, Indiana. Um, we do find them in Lake County and LaPorte County, and and I guess there's a whole rookery of them. I'm just so excited to hear about them, Sarah. So I don't want to say anything more. I'll let Sarah do her introduction, and we'll just get on with the program. Thank you all so very, very much. Oh, one more thing. If you have a question, put it in the chat, and we'll try and get that to Sarah as soon as possible. And then if you can keep yourself on mute so we don't have any extra noises. And if you have trouble putting it in the chat, um, maybe you can raise your hand or something and get our attention. But if you're on Facebook, just put it in there too in the comment section, and Matt will be watching that too. Okay, Sarah, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction. Can you guys hear me okay? Is that
Yeah.
all? Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Make sure, here, wait, let me see if I can. Maybe I won't be able to. No, we just did this. Okay. Sorry, I changed the way things were organized on my side. There we go. Can you all see that? Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to come talk to you all today, and thank you so much for having me. As was just mentioned, my name is Sarah, and I am currently finishing my master's at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and today I will be talking to you about some of my research that I've been working on with the Black-crowned Night Herons in the Chicagoland region. I do want to give you all a quick heads up. I'm getting over a cold, so apologies in advance if I sound a little schnuffly. I will do my best to keep it together and be presentable. Oh, is that working? All right, 1 second. My clicker. Oh, now we're working. There we go. Okay. So before we jump into the birds, I wanted to start by just giving you guys a little bit more background about me. I graduated from Washington University in St. Louis with a degree in biology in 2020. And then I took a couple of years off doing a whole bunch of different types of seasonal positions, working with a bunch of cool animals, including a bunch of cool birds. So I always like to take an opportunity to kind of spotlight those when I'm talking to people who like birds, until I started my master's in 2023. And so although I am fascinated by avian ecology and conservation, I'm also really broadly interested in sort of applied conservation as a whole at the ecosystem level, particularly in urban settings, which is really what brought me to this project. So here's a very quick agenda to kind of outline the journey we will be going on this today. I'll give you a quick background about Black-crowned Night Herons and this project, and then I will jump into a few of the research questions we've been focusing on, the fieldwork and the methods included with data collection and analysis, and then some of what we've learned so far and sort of the conservation implications of that work, and then finally, what is a little sneak peek of what's to come in the future. So, as many of you probably know, black-crowned night herons are a globally distributed wading bird. And by wading bird, I mean a long-legged wetland species like a heron, egret, ibis, or stork. They are usually thought to be crepuscular, so they're most active at dawn and dusk, or nocturnal, hence the night heron part of their name. They are dependent on wetlands primarily for foraging and breeding traditionally, and they are partial migrants, which means that some of their populations are actually resident, so particularly down in the southeastern parts of their range, black-crowns are there year-round. But there are also many migratory populations, including those that nest in the Great Lakes region. And then finally, they're a pretty long-lived species. So they can kind of live anywhere from 3 to 15 years. And sort of the longest record is like a 21-year-old black-crowned night heron. And that has some implications for kind of their general life history strategies. So despite their global distribution, black-crowned night heron populations are declining. They are listed as a special status species in 11 states, and they've faced particularly steep declines in the Great Lakes and in the Northeast. And so if you look at this little map down here on the right, pretty much anywhere that isn't blue black-crowns are not doing particularly well. And there are a lot of potential reasons for this. The leading cause is primarily, wetland conversion and degradation and destruction, so habitat loss. But they are also probably facing challenges from pollution and contamination of aquatic environments, as well as from climate change. Oh, and I will note they are listed in Indiana and they have been state endangered in Illinois since 1977. And with that, I'm going to shift into some very brief background about this work and the history of black crowns in Chicago in general, and in a little bit in Indiana. And so black crowns have nested in Illinois for centuries, but one of the kind of last major strongholds for the species was in the Calumet region, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. And so this area was once dominated by wetlands surrounding Lake Calumet. However, they were mostly drained and converted to heavy industry and manufacturing. But they still supported several colonies of black-crowned night herons in a couple of spots, particularly at Big Marsh, Indian Ridge Marsh, and Heron Pond, starting starting in the 1900s, 1800s, but until the 2000s approximately. But unfortunately, due to kind of a series of hydrological fluctuations, kind of continued disturbance and degradation from the manufacturing and kind of other human activities that were happening at these sites, the birds ultimately completely abandoned the sites by the end of the 2000s and started moving up to Chicago. And they moved around a couple of different times between leaving Calumet and the present. But all you really need to know is that by 2022, pretty much all of the black-crowned night herons that were nesting in this region and really in northeastern Illinois in general were concentrated at that blue square, which is the Lincoln Park Zoo. And now that is really by far the largest and really the last major rookery in Illinois. And so the birds actually nest in the trees at the zoo, specifically in the Pritzker Family Children's Zoo. And so this is an area kind of on the perimeter of the zoo where the red wolves and black bear enclosures are. And so staff at the Lincoln Park Zoo's Urban Wildlife Institute have been monitoring the population at the zoo sort of since they arrived. And that has really shown, especially in the last couple of years, hundreds and hundreds of adults breeding consistently at the zoo, with the past couple of years, anywhere from 600 to 700 adults being documented, and over 400 chicks being documented. And so basically, it's a huge rookery, and it seems to be doing quite well. However, there really has not been a lot of work to try and better understand how the birds are successfully surviving and reproducing within the really highly urban landscape of Chicago. And so our team was hoping that by studying the space use, habitat selection, and activity patterns of the species, we could really advance our understanding of black-crowned night heron breeding season ecology, which we really don't know that much about. They're a surprisingly understudied species, but also potentially reveal kind of species-specific needs to support the conservation efforts for the species in Illinois throughout, in Chicago, throughout Illinois, and kind of throughout their range. And so that kind of brings me to the three major research questions I'll be covering today. And so those are, what is the home range of a black-crowned night heron and what factors drive variation in home range size? What habitats do black-crowned night herons utilize for foraging and roosting within a highly urban landscape? And then how do black-crowned night herons distribute their activity patterns across the 24-hour period? What that really means are they really nocturnal? And to answer most of these questions, we really needed to figure out how to catch these birds, which ultimately ended up being a lot more challenging than we were anticipating. I like to describe it as kind of an extremely Looney Tunes capture methodology that proved to be surprisingly effective. And so it all starts with fish. That is what we used as our bait. And we originally tried to bait birds to specific capture locations, but ultimately ended up catching birds within the colony. And so we started with live fish, but ultimately realized they'll eat dead fish just as quickly. So we used frozen fish that we actually got from the zoo as bait for our traps, which basically look like a big box. And so this is a giant black-crowned night heron trap. We baited this with fish, and so sort of habituated the birds to this over the course of several weeks. And then once we kind of monitored them using game cameras. So as you can see here, the birds ultimately figured out that there was fish in these buckets, and we kind of lured them deeper and deeper into the traps until we saw that birds were consistently using these traps to find food. And then once that process had kind of concluded, we finished putting the trap together. So this is what the final setup looks like. There's a door that is above the entrance, and the bait bucket is all the way at the back of the trap. And so, so we would basically monitor this with baby monitors this past year. We would spy on the birds from kind of blinds behind the scenes, and we would wait until a bird kind of went all the way into the back of the trap. And then we had a little trigger, like it's a remote control for like a little car, like a little remote control car. It hits a little switch, the door falls down, and then we could go and get the heron. And so once we had the heron in hand, the first thing we always do is we band it. And so they get two bands. One is a USGS aluminum band, which is their special federal government ID. Every single bird that gets banded in the US gets one of these. But we also gave them an alphanumeric band. And so if you look really closely, that one says A43 on it. And so that is sort of the bird's ID. That is its name tag. That is how I'll refer to them throughout this presentation. And that is also in the hopes that if people spot banded birds, they're actually able to read that number and report where they found the bird to us. Once the bird is banded, we take a bunch of measurements. So that's kind of an example of us measuring the tarsus bone, which is a really good metric for kind of bird's body size, kind of throughout the whole year. We also take a bunch of health samples. So this past year, we were able to collect blood samples, several different swabs in order to kind of dive into more of the health of the population in terms of parasites and disease exposure, as well as heavy metal exposure. And then finally, this is sort of my favorite part, we put a satellite transmitter on them. So we give them basically a little backpack that has a device on it that helps us collect GPS and activity data. And once, oops, let me see if I can get the video to work. Once that's all done, we let them go. And they fly off back into the colony. And so these transmitters are what really serve as kind of the main method of data collection for this project. And so they're really lightweight. So they only weigh about 16 to 18 grams, which is less than 3% of each bird's body weight, which is kind of that threshold we use when we're putting things on birds to make sure that, you know, it doesn't impact their ability to fly or any of their other natural behaviors. And they're solar powered, so they get charged by exposure to the sun, and that's what kind of keeps their battery alive. And so they wear it like a backpack, as I sort of described, with a really stretchy material that goes kind of down their chest and underneath their wings. And so this bird is actually the first bird we ever tagged, and as you can see, this is A23, you can't see it anymore because the bird has kind of preened all its feathers back into place and secured the transmitter after it's been released. And so these transmitters have a bunch of different sensors on them, but the main types of data we're going to focus on today are GPS data, which is really just a latitude and a longitude that gets collected every hour, and then accelerometer data. And so that accelerometer is kind of what's in like a Fitbit or kind of a workout watch. It helps us better understand how much the bird is moving around, and that is measured using a principle called overall dynamic body acceleration, or ODBA. And ODBA is sort of our proxy for, is the bird sitting pretty still or is it moving around a lot? And so low values mean that it's not very active, and high values mean that the bird is super active. Sorry, my clicker is being weird. Okay. So in 2023 and 2024, our team tagged 17 adults with these satellite transmitters, and we also banded a ton of juveniles within the colony. And so this map is sort of a snapshot of what that raw data looks like. And so each of the points is a single GPS reading, and then each color refers to a different bird. And so I basically took all of these GPS points and used them to determine a whole bunch of different things, including whether or not individuals were breeding or not breeding, estimate their home range size, and then identify and characterize all of the habitats that they use outside the colony. And so this map is sort of the foundation of what we'll be seeing later in the presentation. So initially, because we caught all these birds in the colony, we assumed that they would all be breeding. But after examining the data, I realized that about 5 of our birds actually left the colony within about a week of being tagged. We also had one bird who was really weird, and it would leave the colony for like 3 to 5 days at a time, and then it would come back, but then it would leave again. And it was gone for so long that we basically determined there was no way it could possibly be raising chicks. And so all of those birds we consider to be our non-breeding birds. In most cases, these birds left so early in the season that they could not have successfully bred before they left the colony. In contrast, we also had a bunch of birds that did appear to be breedings. And so these birds showed these really repetitive movements to and from the colony for an extended period of time. So they'd spend long periods within the colony, they would leave for short periods to go find food, and they would never be away for so long that it wouldn't be possible for them to be raising chicks. And so those we consider to be our breeding birds. And so once we had established that, I moved into trying to better understand each bird's space use within the city. And so a home range is basically the area where an animal spends most of its time and carries out its daily activities. And so in most cases, we actually can quantify home ranges using what's called a utilization distribution, which basically means if you take like we call it so the total home range, this is kind of the idea of like, this is where you're most likely to find the bird. We call it a 95% utilization distribution, which just means that 95% of the time you're going to find the bird in this area. So in this map, that's the dark green. And then we have a 50% utilization distribution, which we also call like the core home range, which means, about half the time the bird is going to be in this area. That is really its home base. And so, and yeah, that's the light green area on that map. And as you can see, that's kind of estimated from where all the points are that are collected by the GPS transmitter. And so for my tagged black-crowned night herons, I was able to estimate the size of these home ranges from that GPS data using a type of modeling called continuous time movement modeling, which estimates home range size based on where this bird was every hour. And it also is kind of specialized to account for some potential issues with GPS data that I don't need to get into right now, but if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to describe it more later. But yeah, so for my thesis and for my research, I was looking at both the total home ranges and the core home ranges. But for the purpose of this talk, I really want to focus on that total home range because the results were similar, and I think it's a little bit easier to get a sense of what these birds were really doing. And so these estimated home ranges for black crowns in Chicago ended up showing huge variation. So some of these birds used a total home range that was, 2 kilometers, 2 square kilometers, and others had home ranges that were like thousands of square kilometers. And so in order to try and better understand what was driving this variation, I ran some statistical models that assessed the potential influence of body mass, breeding status, so that breeding or non-breeding, sex, and land cover composition within each home range to see if any of those factors were really driving these really big differences in home range size. And so for that land cover variable, I really focused on the relationship between home range size and the percentage of that home range that was modified or developed habitat. So basically, how densely urbanized was the area that the bird was using. And so I'll skip kind of over like the nitty gritty of the stats because I really want to focus on the final results. But again, if anyone has any methods questions, I'm happy to address them. Okay, so jumping kind of into our results, neither mass nor sex were good predictors of how big a bird's home range was. However, their breeding status and how densely urban the habitat they were using was were both associated with home range size. And so on average, non-breeding birds had much larger total estimated home ranges than breeding birds. So they were about 4 times bigger. Additionally, the smaller home ranges contained much higher proportions of modified land cover than smaller home ranges. So basically, smaller home ranges were more densely urbanized than bigger ones. And so what does that really mean? This is kind of a map of all of those birds' home ranges, because I want to start by focusing on this effective breeding status. And so non-breeding birds are the red shapes on this map, and they again had a much larger overall area of use. I think that's pretty clear from looking at the map. The breeding birds were the yellow shapes, and then that little house is the colony. And so ultimately, I think that breeding birds had smaller home ranges because they are central place foragers, while non-breeders are not. And this is what I mean when I mean central place foragers. So these are the tracks of one of our breeding birds. And as you can kind of see, it is shooting around to the same locations and always returning to that central spot where the bird started, which is the colony. And so basically the birds, the breeding birds, are somewhat restricted in the types of habitats that they can use to find food because they really want to use as little energy as possible to find food for themselves and their chicks. It's really, really energy intensive to perform these reproductive behaviors, to make sure your chicks have enough to eat, make sure you have enough food to eat. And so this probably leads to higher sites of site foraging fidelity. So basically, they're going back to the same places over and over again where they're able to successfully find food that are also pretty close to that central location, which is the colony. Non-breeding birds don't have to do that. And so they generally seem to show kind of more exploratory behavior where they, once they leave the colony, they are maybe in search of, the best place to find food and hang out and roost once they're no longer connected to the single location. And so that probably results in that larger estimated home range. Additionally, as I mentioned, the percent of modified land cover within the home range was also closely associated with home range size. And I think that that is mostly just because of the location of the colony. And so as you can see on this map, the gray is modified land cover and the green is natural land cover. And so where the birds are nesting in Lincoln Park, that's really like a big green spot on the water. But the area directly surrounding it is super, super urbanized. It's very much very close to downtown Chicago. And so the smaller home ranges that are also usually closer to the colony, so for example, like the breeding birds, they're using habitats that are more densely urbanized because the area closest to the colony is really urbanized. But as birds start to kind of explore, they're no longer breeding, they're not attached to the colony anymore, they seem to be moving further away to habitats further from the city, where there are kind of higher concentrations of natural area. And that is kind of contributing to this relationship between urbanization of the home ranges and how big those home ranges are. And then finally, I want to note that home ranges are important because in addition to better understanding, how big of an area is this bird using, it is also often used as a proxy for habitat quality. And so basically this suggests that even though some of these small home ranges are really densely urbanized, they are offering, relatively high quality habitat, or at least enough areas for birds to find food. Because if they weren't, the birds would travel further away. And so there are clearly some suitable resources and some really important habitats that are close to the colony that are supporting breeding birds. So in addition to looking at home range size and this kind of more general idea about space use through this analysis, I also wanted to better understand, specifically what habitats were birds using when they weren't in the colony. And so basically I went through every single one of my tagged birds and I manually identified the locations that each bird was and assigned them to one of these habitat types. So birds consistently used parks and forest preserves, golf courses, cemeteries, rivers or creeks, harbors or breakwaters. And by breakwater, I mean these kind of concrete structures out in Lake Michigan that are used to help prevent wave action. The Lake Michigan shoreline. So here's an example where you can see some birds hanging out in the harbor and the docks, but also kind of along this concrete area along the shoreline. Campuses, school campuses, residential areas, and then commercial or industrial areas. And this is actually the ArcelorMittal steel mill on the Indiana side of the Calumet area. And so one of our birds actually went and checked this spot out for a couple of days. And this is actually the location of really one of the last Black-crowned Night Heron rookeries in Indiana. So that was super interesting. And then once I had characterized all of these data points, I basically kind of determined birds' habitat preferences based on the proportion of the habitats that they used. And so for each of these birds, I took all of the GPS points that were in each of these different habitat types and kind of divided it by the total number of GPS points that their transmitters collected. And so that kind of gave me a general sense of, what frequency are birds using what types of habitats. And then additionally, I calculated how far away all of these habitats were from the colony, just to kind of get a better sense of how far are birds traveling for foraging and roosting habitat. And so these are kind of what those frequencies look like. So each of these columns is a bird, and the colors correlate to different habitat types. So all of the green, those are our urban green spaces, parks, forest preserves, and some golf courses. And then the blues correlate to other kind of water habitats, so rivers, harbors, Lake Michigan, and then you've got kind of the reds and browns and stuff, and those are kind of anthropogenic habitats that the birds are mostly either stopping over for short periods or kind of flying over during the day. And so, as you can see, some birds were much more habitat specialized. So we have columns that are, completely one color or almost completely one color. Birds that really, really love a specific park, for example. But then we have other birds that are kind of using more of a combination of habitat type. So, maybe they're using some park habitat, but also some harbors, some Lake Michigan shorelines, some of the river. And additionally, I really want to highlight that there is green in pretty much every single one of these columns, except for the one that's all blue. And I do think it's important to mention that that bird was foraging along the river, but it was specifically in a part of the river that is in the middle of a big park. And so urban green spaces, in one way or another, are really critical for all of these birds. But I do want to point out that if we look at the breeding birds, they have a lot more of this kind of medium blue color, and that is connected to Lake Michigan. And so basically, breeding birds used foraging habitat within Lake Michigan at a much higher frequency than non-breeding birds. And then additionally, breeding birds typically, like the mean distance, the average distance of the habitats that breeders were using was only about 3.75 kilometers from the colony, whereas non-breeders mostly used an average distance habitats at an average distance of like 21 kilometers away from the colony. So breeding birds are staying close to the colony, and the non-breeders, once they're kind of not interested in the colony anymore, they're using habitats that are much further away than where we originally caught them. Oops. Ah, okay. Now to kind of zoom in on those habitat selection results, this map on the left is looking at that, looking at those proportions in a different way. And so basically, each of these points is again a breeding bird and all of the locations that it used over the course of the breeding season. And as you can see, they're really concentrated in these green areas or along the river or the lakefront. They are also pretty much all within 10 kilometers of the colony, which is where that white kind of semicircle is. And that's sort of kind of, wading birds are typically thought to travel up to 10 to 20 kilometers away from their colony to forage during the breeding season. So these birds are all able to find habitats that are pretty darn close to the colony. And then our non-breeding birds, we really have to zoom out because again, these birds are using habitats that are further away from the colony. And so that white semicircle is the same, but as you can hopefully see, there's a lot more dots that are further away that are in these more densely blue and green natural and wetland areas. And again, this is probably because, they're no longer restricted to that central roost site in the highly modified part of downtown. And so they might disperse to these areas that kind of have larger or more concentrated natural areas, more in the suburbs, or they could be reducing competition with the breeding birds that are utilizing these habitats that are really close to the colony. They could also be prospecting. So these birds either failed to breed or stopped, kind of left off in the middle of the breeding season. And so they also might have been traveling around looking for other colonies if their first nest attempt was unsuccessful, or they really just faced high competition at the zoo. So ultimately, these birds could have left for a bunch of different reasons, but importantly, they are using varieties of habitats that are further away from kind of where we caught them originally. So what all of these habitats have in common is that they contain water bodies that support populations of fish and crustaceans that black crowns feed on. And so these urban green spaces are really so valuable because most of them contain lagoons or wetlands, which in many cases have kind of more manicured shorelines that allow birds to easily access prey sources kind of along the edges of these wetlands. They often have kind of natural perching options such as branches, logs, fallen rocks, or fallen logs and rocks. And they may even kind of have increased aquatic productivity because of sort of runoff from fertilizers in the surrounding parks and areas. And so these are all pictures of lagoons or wetlands in urban areas. And you may or may not be able to tell that, 2 of these are in urban parks, but 2 of them are actually in a golf course and a cemetery. So all of these water bodies can support black. And many of them contain naturally occurring, are really critically important for most birds. And then additionally, a lot of birds are using the Chicago River, and they're using both restored and more commercial parts of the river. So if you look at these 2 pictures on the left is a restored part of the river, and the right is a super downtown part of the river. And we know there are black crowns using both of these types of habitat. So that little red circle has a black-crowned night heron in it. And so basically, um, they can actually use the river because it also has a bunch of these naturally occurring fish species and crustacean species. But even kind of the more commercial parts of the river still have shallow areas and parts of the shoreline that allow birds to access them. And they might even have like artificial light that is helping concentrate fish towards the edges, which is helping them hunt. And this map on the right is really highlighting that pretty much all of our breeding birds that used the river used the same section of the river. So there's kind of a 2.5 kilometer stretch that is right near the North Avenue turning basin and then up to an area called the Webster Wildlife Site. And this is really concentrating birds. It is also, much more like this downtown photo. It is super commercial, industrialized. This is actually has kind of the most sewage areas, sewage outputs on the whole river, and yet our birds are using them a lot. And I think that the main reason is there's still food there, and so they'll go where the food is. But additionally, it's also kind of the closest stretch to the colony, and so that kind of comes back to this idea of like, it might not be perfect, but it is close by enough that they can kind of reduce their overall energy expenditure going to visit these sites and then coming back, really trying to reserve their energy during the breeding season. And then finally, we saw a lot of use of harbors, breakwaters, and other parts along Lake Michigan. And so the docks in the harbors and these breakwaters going into Lake Michigan actually offer black crowns these kind of artificial perches that allow them to hunt in the deeper water of Lake Michigan where they otherwise wouldn't be able to. So these are kind of 2 pictures of black crowns using the shoreline at Montrose Harbor, or these kind of, we called them star docks. Birds would kind of use the edge of these to hunt off of, and I have a video of that in a second. But yeah, so basically these anthropogenic structures are really allowing birds to exploit kind of unexpected habitat along the lake. Additionally, we know that some fish species actually use the harbors to spawn, and so that kind of creates these like opportunistic feasting events for the birds. And also, again, those artificial lights really probably play a role in bringing the fish closer to these areas that allow the birds to access them. But yeah, so in order to hunt in this deeper water, most of the time when we think of black crowns hunting, they're standing really, really still, looking into the water, waiting for something to swim by, and then kind of darting at it. But in order to hunt into this deep water, they actually show this plunge behavior where they jump off of these surfaces and then grab fish kind of like a gull. So I do have a short video of this. It's a little hard to see, but there's a heron on the front of this star dock, but look at the red circle. So the bird is kind of peering over the edge, getting ready, and then jumps in, grabs something, jumps out, and flies right back to the dock. And so during kind of alewife spawning, we saw them doing this, fighting over this dock space, doing it every night, really competitively, fighting for these birds, and showing these really cool, unusual hunting behaviors. So that kind of wraps up sort of my habitat use, space use part of this presentation. But we also used activity data to try and better understand birds' DL activity patterns. So DL activity patterns basically just means how do they distribute their energy over the 24-hour period. And once again, we're using overall dynamic body acceleration as kind of our measure of how active they are. So again, they're night herons, right? So we usually think of them as being crepuscular or nocturnal. So we expect to see kind of these patterns in their activity where, they're really active during dawn, dusk, or over the nighttime period, but they're kind of chilling out during the day. Yeah. So these are just kind of some graphs to give you an idea of what that could look like. But that is really not what we saw with the birds that we tagged. And so this is a comparison between activity levels while birds were breeding versus when they were not breeding. And so basically during the breeding season, as you can see on the left, the different colors are all different times of day. And so except for at dusk, kind of their general overall activity at dawn, during daytime, and at nighttime was much higher in the breeding season than in the non-breeding season. It's pretty similar with at dusk. There's a lot of variation. We don't really know what's going on. But in general, kind of activity levels were higher while birds were breeding. And while they were breeding, their activity levels were also highest at dawn. And so that's kind of that reddish color up in the corner. I really want to point out, though, that there wasn't really a big difference in their overall activity during the day and during the night. So that's the green and the purple. And so, that's not what we would have expected. And we see that pattern while they're breeding and while they're non-breeding. So again, while they're not breeding, it looks like nighttime activity is a little bit higher, but that's actually not a statistically significant difference. In general, both during the breeding season and during the non-breeding season, birds were active at about equal rates. And so this is really interesting, right? So these urban birds are more active during the breeding season, almost around the clock than in the non-breeding season. And that makes sense. We do actually know that black crowns during the breeding season probably spend a lot more time kind of out and about during the day, because if they're just out at night, there's actually not enough hours in the nighttime for them to find enough food for themselves and their chicks. So, we expect, all of these breeding activities, they take a lot of energy. They might be more foraging more frequently, flying back and forth between the colony, bringing food back for their chicks. But they also might be doing just more activities in the colony during the day. So that can include things like nest building, interacting with their chicks, interacting with other conspecifics that they're in close proximity to. And then once they don't have to, engage in all these reproductive behaviors, their overall activity rates decrease as they kind of settle in and prepare for the rest of the season to kind of rest and refuel for migration. So that's kind of a clear explanation for why breeding activity would be higher than non-breeding activity. But the fact that this activity during the day really continues even after birds are not breeding. And so this could be because in Chicago, unlike more southeastern parts of the range, again, where there are a lot of these residential populations, in those areas, they share these habitats with a lot of other wading bird species. And they are competitors directly over a lot of the same food sources. And so one thought of why black crowns nest at night or forage at night primarily is actually kind of a way to avoid competition with these more diurnal waders. But in Chicago, they actually don't face a ton of competition. There are a couple of neighborhood great blue herons, but for the most part, they're just competing with other black crowns. So there isn't actually kind of anything that's keeping them to this evening schedule, especially because they see just as well during the day as they do at night. They're not like owls where, their eyes are really specialized for nighttime foraging. They do show some adaptations that suggest that they actually see better than other types of herons during the evening. So they have like really good night vision, but they also see really well during the day. And so basically, they might also be just kind of responding to the conditions in Chicago, where they might also be trying to avoid human activity at certain times of day. They might be responding to kind of changes in artificial light at night. So all of these kind of environmental and social factors might actually be contributing to black crowns being more active during the day, even when they're not breeding. And it's just kind of another example of kind of how flexible and adaptable this species is to living in urban areas. But this does kind of raise the question, when do they sleep? Because if they're active all the time, they have to sleep at some point. And so it might be they're sleeping at dusk. So we saw that during the breeding season and during the non-breeding season, activity at dusk is by far the lowest. But it could also just be that these methods aren't really capturing sleep very well. Some birds actually kind of take naps as opposed to these long, continuous stretches of sleeps like mammals do. And so the fact that this method kind of takes many like 10-minute increments of activity, it might not be actually capturing when they are sleeping very well. It could also be that black-crown's kind of general behavior is making it hard for us to use this metric to measure their activity. And that is because a lot of their foraging, aside from when, they're plunging into the lake, a lot of it is them standing pretty still for extensive periods of time. And so that could also look like rest. And so basically, it's a little bit hard for us to detect, when were they sleeping? And there's probably a lot of variation between individuals. And on that note, I do really want to acknowledge, this entire project was really focused on looking at these general trends and patterns in black-crowned night heron behavior in Chicago. But I do want to highlight that at the end of the day, these were all individual birds who were doing their own things for their own reasons. And so these are a couple of pictures of 4 of our tagged birds when they were back in the colony. And so all of their decisions could also be influenced by factors that we can't measure. So it could be things like age, genetics, personality even. But I do think it's really important for us, in addition to studying kind of these broader trends, to study these individuals because they can really help highlight kind of these underlying dynamics in the populations, potentially different habitat requirements that birds need to survive, specifically like, in this case, breeding versus non-breeding birds. Or they could be helping, us better understand how this species is so adaptable to different kind of conditions. And so this individuality likely contributes to, why birds bred or didn't breed, and some of that underlying variation in home range size and habitat preferences. And so personally, I think that a big factor here that we can't measure, unfortunately, is age. And I think that is driving a lot of these differences between birds. And that is probably because, this is a pretty long-lived species. And all of the birds that we tagged, we know are at least 3, but they're probably year after year, the longer they breed in Chicago, gaining experience, getting older, getting a better sense of, what are the best habitats to go to, what are the worst habitats to go to, what are their favorite spots to find food, what are the foraging strategies that work best for them. And these factors are probably significantly affecting kind of the places that they're going, the habitats they're using, and the amount of space they use, as well as probably their activity patterns. And so, for example, birds who are just more familiar with Chicago might show kind of like higher site fidelity to these areas and be more likely to actually successfully breed and use the same types of habitats. So again, that's just kind of another example of how individuals might differ in the study and how important it is to kind of try and better understand what else might be going on here. And so I know that was a lot of information, but I do want to try and kind of bring it all together at the end and highlight some of the conservation implications of these findings. And so black-crowned night herons are incredibly flexible, and they can clearly adapt to urban landscapes, but they still face threats to their survival. And so this kind of raises the question, why are they still declining if they're so flexible? And we aren't really 100% sure. It could be due to kind of increasing competition with these larger-bodied birds, so like great egrets, great blue herons, double-crested cormorants, in these parts of their ranges where they've already lost a lot of habitat. But they also could be kind of facing impacts from pollution. It could be the effects of climate change, as I sort of mentioned earlier, where things like more intense weather kind of increase threats to black-crowned chicks and eggs that are really vulnerable during the breeding season. But really, more research is necessary to kind of pinpoint the direct threats to this species. Additionally, well-managed water bodies in urban areas can support black-crowns, but we really must protect these habitats in the highly modified areas from additional anthropogenic threats, such as fishing line, which can be really dangerous for birds that are using a lot of these parks and urban water bodies that are also used for fishing, as well as things like exposure to industrial and commercial pollutants that affect these waterways that are so important to these breeding birds. And then additionally, we do really need to think about not only the water bodies that, are used by these breeding birds, but also the non-breeding birds, because all of these habitats close and far from the colony are important to this population as a whole. And then finally, the fact that this colony is so large and that some portion of the population isn't breeding really supports the fact that we need to create more suitable habitat for black-crowned night herons in the Chicagoland area. And so I really think that we can use some of this information to help design other or like help identify other sites for these like floating non-breeding populations to utilize in the future, hopefully, to help kind of reinforce and support this population. And so one of the things our team is doing in response to these needs is an experiment that we refer to as kind of conspecific attraction experiments. And basically, conspecific attraction means that colonial birds like black-crowned night herons are attracted to areas where there are other members of their species. And so we are using what we've learned about black-crowned night heron colonies to basically build fake colonies at several sites in Illinois. And that includes sites at Big Marsh, which is in the Calumet area. We just created a new one at Jackson Park, which is a little bit closer to downtown, as well as sites at Almond Marsh, and we're working on one kind of further west. So what these sites look like are we put out a bunch of black-crowned night heron decoys, as well as we play black-crowned night heron vocalizations, and we put out nests that are all in the hopes of attracting birds to the site and showing them that they are signals that, you know, this is a good place to breed. There are other birds here, with the hopes that birds will eventually establish colonies at these additional sites to help bolster the population at the zoo and be kind of additional protected places for birds to go in case there is a major disturbance or abandonment event at the zoo colony. And so we've kind of gone through a bunch of iterations of this over the years, but all the way on the right, this is our newest decoy, thanks to Amy and George from the Windy City Bird Lab, who have started 3D printing decoys. I'll show you guys some more pictures later, who are making them much more realistic, and we're hoping even more attractive to black crowns in this upcoming season. And so in terms of future plans, we are done tagging black crowns, but we are going to be continuing with the conspecific attraction work that we've been doing. And we still actually have a ton of data on these birds that we've tagged so far. And so in addition to, you know, all this stuff we're learning about the breeding season, we're also hoping to be able to use this information from birds after they leave the colony to better understand, you know, the habitats that this black-crowned population uses at all times of year, because that's really important to their conservation as a migratory species. And then additionally, all of those health samples that we collected earlier, we're actually using to do a bunch of other work. My colleague at the Lincoln Park Zoo, Henry Adams, they are a disease ecologist, and so we're hoping to dive a little bit deeper in kind of the population health of these birds that we've tagged. And then one of the things I'm most excited for is looking at heavy metal exposure in some of the samples we collected from birds to try and better understand, you know, what habitats, if the habitats that they're using are facing other forms of pollution, that we can kind of better understand and manage for in order to help protect these populations. And so yes, in terms of once they leave the colony, you know, as I mentioned, this is a migratory population. And so this is one of our birds, A24. And once October kind of ish rolls around, these birds leave the Chicago area. And so before this study, we actually had no idea where this population was spending the winter, but we do now have a couple of like full migration tracks to better understand, you know, where these birds are traveling the rest of the year. And so this is A24. This is a bird we tagged in 2023. And this is a map of its 3 migrations so far. So how it traveled down to Florida in the fall and then back up to Chicago last spring. And then it recently got back down to Florida, or not that recently, this past winter, went back to the same site in Florida to spend another winter. And we know it's still there right now, but hopefully we'll be heading back up to Chicago pretty soon for this 2025 breeding season. And so specifically, A24 was wintering actually on a Seminole reservation in Florida, in this really cool kind of working landscape of kind of cattle farming and restored wetlands. And it used this site 2 years in a row. And we also know that it did, we think, successfully breed in this past breeding season. It's actually the only tagged birds we've been able to find its nest. This is a picture from Amy of A24 raising 3 chicks in the colony in 2024. And so that's really exciting to get to better understand, you know, the whole life cycle of the species using this technology. We know a couple of other birds are also spending the winter in the Gulf Coast, so in Louisiana, kind of south of New Orleans. And then we have another bird that's actually down in Cuba right now, which is really exciting because it's our kind of first international migrant. And so before kind of wrapping everything up, I just want to take one more minute to kind of reiterate why we're doing this research and why we really want it to continue. And so even though this is only data from, a handful of birds from an enormous colony, we have learned so much more information about the adaptability of the species and the range of habitats that they're using to survive in Chicago. And so these transmitters should also last several years. So like these previous pictures, we can get a better sense of like how these birds are using these habitats and how they might change from year to year. And then we can also hopefully better integrate what we're learning from our health studies and the heavy metal data to get a better sense of kind of how this colony is doing overall and learn more about the spaces that this population relies on during the non-breeding season. So ultimately, we hope that this project is helping kind of advance our understanding of the behavior and ecology of this really cryptic species that is of conservation concern in so many places in the United States. And we really wanted to help kind of inform future management decisions to help them persist in these areas and showcase how we can kind of create urban spaces that support both humans and biodiversity like black-crowned night herons. And so if you're interested in learning more or potentially volunteering with us, we are still kind of working out the kinks for this upcoming breeding season, but we do have a sign up so that if you're interested in volunteer opportunities, you can follow this QR code on the bottom of the page. And that will kind of put you on an email list that we will reach out to as we have kind of opportunities appear. And then additionally, Amy has been doing so much amazing outreach work. She's getting ready to start her rookery roost again, which she does periodically throughout the breeding season to give people an opportunity to come and learn more about the birds and see them in person. So if you're interested in that, please follow her on Instagram. I will have all of these links on another slide as well, so don't worry if you miss it. And then finally, she's also done an amazing job kind of getting some merch going for the project, working with a local artist named Rebecca Jasso to create kind of this amazing logo, make t-shirts, hats, and bags. So if you're interested, there's a bunch of people wearing them in this picture. They're just really comfy shirts. All of those links can be found at the first QR code on this page. So again, tons of opportunities to kind of continue staying connected to the project, learning more about the work that we're continuing to do. And if you are ever kind of in the Lincoln Park area during the breeding season, opportunities to come learn more about the birds in person. And then finally, this was not just my work. This is the work of an enormous, amazing team of people and organizations. And I just really want to try and acknowledge them and all of these groups that we work with. Every time I talk about the work, it's really exciting. Work really closely with Lincoln Park Zoo, Illinois DNR, generous funding from the Illinois Audubon Society, Chicago Parks District, Chicago Black-crowned Night Heron Project, Bird Conservation Network. All of these incredible people have been such an important part of this project. And then finally, I'm going to want to be taking questions at the end, but do just want to point out these are those same QR codes and then also the link to follow if you're interested in kind of learning more about the Rookery Roost and other opportunities on Instagram. But yeah, that's basically what I have and would love to take any questions. Thank you, guys.
Wonderful, wonderful program. Boy, I learned so much. We do have some questions. We did have in the chat. I don't know if you're maybe outside the scope of your area that you looked at. But Alan
Wait.
says that he knows that they have nested at Baker's Lake. I don't know if you're familiar with these areas. Baker's
Yes.
Lake, Lake Renwith, and Helmick Nature Preserve.
Yes.
Do you know if there's any recent success with nesting there now?
Yeah, so there are currently not really black crowns nesting at any of those locations anymore, unfortunately. I'm pretty sure it might have been Lake Renwick, might have had one pair within the last couple of years, one or two pairs in the last couple of years, but it is primarily dominated by great egrets, double-crested cormorants, and I think there are some great blues nesting at some of those locations as well. And so those are some situations that are really good examples of places that black crowns historically did nest, but they have been kind of outcompeted by these larger bodied birds. And so particularly these areas where there used to be trees and other kind of standing vegetation the birds nested in that all died over time, which is a natural part of the rookery process, where we've put up these amazing like nesting platforms, which are great and have brought birds back and birds are using them. But for the most part, those platforms are not super suitable for black crowns in the way that they are typically built. They're a little bit too big and too open. And so the big birds do really well on them. But little birds like black crowns kind of end up getting pushed down this dominance hierarchy and usually ultimately leave the site. So currently there are not really black crowns nesting there. The really only other habitats we know they're using, the only other colonies, there is one out at Emaquan National Wildlife Refuge, which is out west near Havana. And that is kind of a cattail colony that we don't really know how big it is, but it is probably the neighborhood of like 50 to 100 pairs max, probably closer to 50 pairs. And then there's a really tiny colony right here in Champaign, in the middle of a subdivision on an island that we check on. And so those are really the only other two colonies we know about consistently have breeding black crowns right now, and then this enormous colony at the zoo.
The other location that they mentioned was the Barbara Brown Reserve at the Botanic Gardens. They seem to see adult and possibly immature, but are they close enough that they could be coming from another colony?
Yeah, so especially a lot of the time people think when they're seeing these juveniles that that might mean that there's nesting nearby, and it technically there could be, but by the time that these juveniles are really dispersing, once they're fully flighted, they're 8+ weeks old. So they have actually gotten to the point where they are dispersing far and wide across the area using habitats, miles and miles and miles away from wherever they nested originally. And so typically that's what I would expect. So I would assume that there are probably not birds nesting there specifically, but that it's probably great habitat for these, especially, juvenile birds who are trying to figure out how to be a heron. They're looking for places where they can find good food, find good habitat. And a lot of that is really exploring. And so kind of as they are, becoming stronger flyers, they are spreading out over pretty far distances. In terms of their dispersal. And so most likely that is what I would anticipate. But if anyone sees evidence of nesting or has an inkling about it, we are also always interested to hear about that and kind of further investigate because it's very possible we're nesting in other places that we don't know about.
Okay. Yeah, because we're always looking for great blue heron nests, but you're
Yeah.
saying that the black-crowned night herons are smaller nesters, so their nests
Yeah.
are going to be smaller than that.
Yeah, so their
It's
nests
still
are smaller and they usually nest in much harder to, like great blues typically because they're so big. They like kind of more open branching if they're going to be in trees, and they're usually very visible because their nests are enormous. Black crown nests are much smaller. And they really like kind of understory, crappy, scrubby vegetation. Um, where they can be kind of hidden from predators and kind of protected from bad weather.
Mm.
And so occasionally, like in the Lincoln Park colony, they're nesting in these tall trees, and some of those are a little bit more open, so you can actually see them from the outside. But like in a lot of their more natural colonies, they're typically kind of lower, denser vegetation, and so they can be a little bit harder to see. Um, and so that's kind of why another reason why it's kind of hard to like know whether or not they're nesting in a particular location.
Okay. Another question that we had was since there's been an increase in the bald eagle population in the Chicagoland area, are they competing for food, or are those eagles a threat as a predator to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. My instinct is to say that they're probably not competing over food, mostly just because bald eagles probably go after much larger prey. And so black crowns can eat bigger fish than you would expect. They can eat fish that are probably, I mean, you probably can't even tell, but like 8 inches long, bigger than you would think they could fit in their mouths. But still, in comparison to what most eagles are going after, probably they're shooting for things on the smaller side. Typically, adult black-crowned night herons don't have a ton of predators, so it's possible if one was injured or kind of in a particularly vulnerable situation, or a bald eagle was particularly hungry, it's not impossible. They're probably in the size of prey that a bald eagle could tackle, but I would think they would be more at a risk to chicks, or even eggs, depending on the situation. And so we have seen cases where there have been like bald eagle nests close to colonies that have probably somewhat contributed to abandonment events, not necessarily just because of their existence, but potentially after going after, chicks or eggs. But for the most part, I don't see them as like a direct threat to the species.
Great. I don't have any other questions on the chat. Um, I don't know if anyone has asked a question on our Facebook comment section. I'm sure that Matt will give us that information if that is available. Um, so what so our study's going to be continuing with, I mean, if the birds still have their backpacks, you'll still be collecting some information from that.
Yeah.
How much longer will the studying going on how will it continue? What's the next step?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, we'll be continuing with those specific attraction sites. And so we've kind of already put those up for the season, kind of creating those sort of fake black-crowned night heron colonies to try and attract birds. So that's something we're hoping to continue into the future. As well as kind of continuing to learn more from the data that's already been collected. So we still have a lot of investigating to do in terms of the health data, as well as hopefully heavy metal data once we get samples back, as well as kind of digging in deeper to what these birds are doing outside the breeding season. So that's all kind of like the data research side, sort of my next set of priorities and Henry's priorities at the zoo. But kind of next phases for the project, in addition to the concept attraction, is really kind of just like increasing kind of the amount of outreach and education we're doing about the species. Really trying to get people excited about black-crowned night herons and on board for a bunch of other cool things about this species and invested in their conservation. And so those kind of partnerships are continuing to form thanks to our team. And yeah, so those are kind of like the main next steps. The main thing we won't be doing again is putting more tags out on new birds, but we'll hopefully still be able to kind of better understand stuff from the birds that we've tagged so far.
Have they
Matt,
started to oh,
oh,
go
hi.
ahead, Amy.
Hi, yes, Matt has chimed in with where do you see the project in 10 years? And
Oh,
I think that we're very hopeful that this work can really plant some seeds for continued development. So I think we all recognize that these birds really need some very concrete steps to really enhance habitat for them, to really start to work with specific land management projects. All of these things take time, resources, funding, interest, people who are committed. So really we view any educational opportunity as a chance to make some connections. Recently I was at Lake Renwick. They're interested in understanding, could this research potentially help them bring black-crowned night herons back? That's an open question, but I think that's an example of how we think that this is really in the beginning stages. If we look at the reddish egret working group that is headed by Clay Green out of Texas, they've been at it for about 25 years. If we look at piping plovers, that's been about 40 years. If we look at many of these other, even back to bald eagles, which was my spark bird as a child when I wrote letters to Congress to save them. I think many of these projects really need the commitment of individuals like us to really say, hey, what can we do to help them? And then how can we find funds to hire great people like Sarah and really get the attention of people like Brad Semmelman's on this call at the IDNR, our natural resources people who are hardworking and have a lot of different things on their agenda. So we really see lots of potential. And another example is, I think machine learning and artificial intelligence could really aid us. So if we look at the 3D printed decoys, that was an idea that I had when I saw the faux great blue herons. I was like, can't we do better? And that was thanks to George Garcia, who started Windy City Bird Lab, who's also very involved in the avian listing project. So that's a whole nother topic that I would encourage all of you to look up. It's really interesting to see how young voices like Sarah and others are stepping up and pairing science and technology and working in very creative ways. So I think we can be very optimistic, but we need to stick to it.
Yeah, no, I think Amy really covered it.
well, I think the specifics of saying, what is the habitat? What are they preferring? Which, what are the breeding and the non-breeding birds really
Yeah.
looking for? Like we mentioned earlier, we do see them in certain areas here in Northwest Indiana. Someone wanted to know if there are any known rookeries in Indiana, and other than past nesting, I think you had listed that there was a bird that hung out at ArcelorMittal,
Yeah.
the steel mills. I don't know. I don't know. Do we have any nesting rookeries here in Indiana?
Yeah.
I don't know of any.
Yeah, as far as I know, the one at ArcelorMittal is the only remaining major rookery. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not really accessible to those of
Right.
us who are birders, but
Yeah.
um just like as I was discussing earlier, oh, Matt Kawasinski has actually tagged an eBird checklist. I don't I don't know how that is, who actually has placed that on eBird. Um, they can pop up sometimes, and we're always
Yeah.
looking. We're always looking for great blue heron nests, and we just happen to have somebody mention in the grocery store, hey, I think maybe we have a couple of nests over here. And we did have a great blue heron a rookery in Beverly Shores that now has bald eagles have taken
Oh,
over and a nest. And actually they lost the first two, and I think the last was they were working on the third nest. So those great blue heron
yeah.
nests have not fared well with all the high winds that we've had.
Yeah.
Um, but it's one of those things where you just have to keep looking.
Yeah.
And I'm anxious to start looking for that kind of habitat that you're talking about, that they're going to be up in the trees, but they're going to want a little bit more congestion
Mhm.
than what the great blue herons, because they need to have a little bit of space to get in there. Um, so we just gotta keep our eyes open, I guess. You never know.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll find something. Maybe the ones that are at Lincoln in Illinois decide, hey, we're gonna go over and look over at Indiana. So Matt does say that the nesting colony at ArcelorMittal Steel is monitored by Amy Kearns, and she is part of Indiana DNR. There we have a number of birds that do nest in the steel mill areas, and they're not very accessible to regular birders, but they are monitored by DNR, and they do report, what's going on. So that's a good thing. I don't think we have any other questions. It's very exciting. I can't wait to go. I have one more question. So
Yeah.
have they started to come back to their nests?
Yes.
Okay. They're
Yes.
just starting
So
now, right?
yeah, they actually start coming back kind of at the end of March. First ones kind of appear sort of mid-March. They started settling back at the colony towards the end of March more. It depends on the weather. It's been really chilly. We
Yeah.
also know there are probably black-crowned. We know there are adults that are sticking around through the winter. So it's also hard to know, which ones are migrants, which ones are adults who have been kind of hunkering down. As long as there are areas where the water doesn't freeze, they technically don't need to migrate. So we are potentially, seeing increasing numbers of birds kind of sticking it out for the winter up here. But yeah, so it's possible that some of those birds who are coming back are kind of birds that haven't gone very far. But there are definitely migrants who are coming back. I think the most recent count was close to 300 birds is what Henry posted the other day. But that could get up to 700 at its
Yeah,
peak. Last
so
year, the most we ever
yeah.
counted was 700. So they're definitely on their way, starting to, really get into that breeding season.
Okay. Any sightings of the crowned night heron?
Yes. Amy probably has more details on this, but the yellow crown was spotted a couple days ago,
Yeah,
right?
the yellow crown is still resident, and it's been a past couple of years that we've had one. Last year we had two that were
Yeah.
at the rookery, and they even came back later in the season and were observed by Sammy Cavendall. So just this phase of the rookery, the birds are getting very active, and you really see the courtship behaviors because the trees have not really leafed out. So if you want a firsthand look at a really cool the behaviors of breedings for black-crowned night heron, you get great viewing because the whole city block on the western side of the zoo, the whole block from Webster to Dickens along Stockton, it's pretty much bleacher seats like a Cubs game. You're right there on the sidewalk. You can see all kinds of things. And those birds right now are looking for mates. Some of them are coupled up. I'm thinking back to what Sarah said with the cold weather we've had, that hatching might be a bit later this year. Last year, the earliest hatch was May 7th. But chicks are going to start, and each distinctive phase. So if you can do it, get to Chicago, try to come during the different stages. Right now it's romance and pair bonding, really cool stuff. And soon it will be the hatching and the fledging, which is also just super cool. So can't praise it enough.
Wonderful. Now, where did you say that location was? You said to go.
Pretty much if you go to the Webster entrance, which is the west side of the zoo, the rookery extends from the Webster entrance south to Dickens, and it's along Stockton. And if you want to make it a day in the city for you birders, you can easily then hop up to Montrose or do a walk around South Pond or go to North Pond. Later in the season, when those birds are fledging, we can see up to 40 juveniles at South Pond on the snags, just trying to figure out how to be a heron. It's hilarious and poignant at the same time.
Sounds like a lot of fun. Well, two of our members, Matt Igleski is now executive director for Chicago Bird Alliance. He was on our board for a while, and I know that he leads a Indiana Dunes Birding Festival pre-fest trip that includes those areas. And of course, his wife, Vicki Igleski, who also works there, has worked with us also at Dunes-Calumet. It's great to hear some of those other locations. I know that there's going to be a native plant restoration at Indian Ridge coming up on May 10th. So hopefully adding native plants to some of the areas that are being restored will help not only the habitat for other birds, but indirectly for the black-crowned night herons too. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah and Amy, for all of your great information. We have a lot of thank yous in the chat for what a great presentation, Sarah. I think that you explained everything very well. I know that when you're doing research, you're getting into a lot of the data and all those specifics. But you kept that to a minimum and really a very nice presentation. I'm very excited about another reason for me to get back into Illinois, even though I grew up there. I'm now kind of an Indiana person. But definitely it has really encouraged me, and I hope others will be encouraged to come and visit the zoo and the colony, and that map of all the places where they like hang out is just great. I mean, wow, fascinating. So thank you very much. And
Thank
thank you
you.
everybody for joining us today. And if anybody needs any information, you can send us an email. We can send it on to Sarah if there are any other questions. And looks like maybe a trip is coming up in the future here.
Awesome. That sounds
Thank
great.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Happy birding.